Picking up stitches from the hat is one of the things that causes people most stress, and I want to demystify and also reassure you. There is almost no wrong way to do this, and all the tips and instructions I give are just trying to help you and to take your fears and worries down rather than increase them. So let's talk about this. What we need to do is we need to flip this so that we are picking up from the inside. So you just need to peel it back enough that you can see the transition round between the ribbing and the main part of the hat. And then we need to pick up roughly as many stitches in the round as we have on the hat. If we needed, we can knit front and back somewhere to increase, or we could knit two together to decrease. You can fudge that first round or even two, because when we do this, because we're picking up above the ribbing, there's a couple of rounds of knitting on the body before we even get below the hat brim. So there's some good fudging area. Now, one of the things that I do recommend, first of all, is that you separate the picking up stitches from the knitting. In a lot of patterns, it will say pick up and knit, and I don't say that, especially when working in the round, trying to pick up and knit. It just makes things a little hard. So that's the first thing we're going to do, is we're going to separate that. And the other thing I'm going to recommend is that you find a narrower needle for this stage than you used for knitting it. So when I knit this hat, I used these needles, and you can see that this red needle is much, much thinner. And it's because when we are knitting, it doesn't matter what the size is of the size we are knitting off of. And so we're going to pick up with all of these, and then we're going to use a bigger needle, the right size needle, to knit them. So let's talk about what that's going to look like. There are a couple of places that you can pick up, and I'm going to, after this, show a technique for running a contrasting yarn into the hat and then using that as another method. So that'll be time-stamped in the description below. So at the top of each one of these, you can see sort of almost like a column on a building with one of those little caps. And you can use that as the place to signal picking up from this stitch. What I'm going to call this a knit stitch, because that's what it looks like on the wrong side. So I could use that to pick that up. Then I will need to find roughly something. So we've got this cap and we've got this little bit here at the top of these two knit columns, but we'd be skipping in between. So we need to find something in between that's roughly the same height. So we could pick this one. And then we could go over here, and we could do the same thing over and over. So sometimes we need to kind of stretch things and pull it apart. So here's where I'm going to be picking up on the knit stitch. This one looks about the same height, but it doesn't really matter. If you find that you've wandered a little bit up and down, it's not really going to matter, because this is going to be knit underneath the brim for a few rounds until the body kind of appears out from under the brim. And it's fine if you don't get it exactly right, if you wander a little bit. It's not going to create a big difference. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to go the round above that. So if this is the cap round, right here, with sort of the cap of that column, if we look at the stitches here, you can see that there's sort of like two horizontal bits when we look at reverse stockinette, and I like to call this the smile because it's the bottom, and this the cap. So that's kind of confusing because I was calling this the cap before, but this is sort of the cap and this is the smile, if you think about that. And you can choose either one of those, whichever one makes you happiest, and just be consistent. That helps it work a little better. But then you could, for instance, go above this round here and pick up, and then you would just continue to always pick up. In this case, I've picked up in the smiles, and so I would just continue. Sometimes I need to push the needle down, because when I do this, I kind of pull and distort. So I'm thinking, okay, well, if this is the last smile that I grab from, this is the next smile to grab from. Now, by moving up like I have, we're actually going to be pulling a little bit more from the hat and a little less from the transition to the ribbing. And so you will actually have a little bit more body on your hat than the other way. But all this to say, the most important thing is to, without stressing yourself out, get approximately the right number of stitches on the needle, trying to be roughly consistent, and just pick up the stitches to start. We're going to knit them in a moment. Another thing I'd like to point out is that you don't have to get the stitches evenly distributed to start. You'll see that I got really comfortable doing this and then knit far more than I needed, or picked up far more than I needed sort of to be even. But once you have them, it's very easy to redistribute. One thing you'll want to do is to make sure that the join between the needles, whether you're doing them on DPNs, it'll be between two needles, or if you're doing the other methods, the join between the needles is lined up with the back of the hat, or the beginning of the round on the hat, which is difficult to see because I have sewn in my end here, and I should have noted it a little more strongly. If, like me, you forget what you're doing, the key thing to remember is that the beginning of the round will line up with the increase line. So right here you can see these little notches of my knit front and back, which means that this plain stitch beside the notch was the very first stitch of that section. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make that the first stitch of my round, since I can't tell based on how tidily I wove in my end. All right, we have picked up, and now it's time to knit. And I'm going to talk about two things here. One is how to do that, and the other is how to not accidentally knit inside out. So let's first talk about knitting. So if you have used a smaller needle, it's very important to remember to knit onto the big needle. The loop size is going to stay the same on this smaller needle because it was made by a big needle when we made that stitch. But we need to remember to work it with this different size. When we pick it up, if you were to pick up, and this is specifically for DPN knitters, if you pick this up and start knitting here, which you could do, you are working on the inside of the hat. And if you continue to make knit stitches here, you will actually end up with reverse stockinette stitch here. Let me show you what that looks like. So we've got our yarn, we've got our stitches, and it's fairly easy to just start going. And for whatever reason in this first round, I get emails, people knitting their gnome bodies inside out, and it's because right here when they started knitting at the wrong point in the triangle, basically. So what that looks like is you can see the bumps of the reverse stockinette inside the hat below the working needle here. And when we go here, can you see how we've got all these bumps which are facing the side of the hat that we want to be the outside? So let's try that again so we don't knit on the outside. So one of the most important things to ask yourself is, when I pick this as the needle I'm going to work off of, do I see the outside of the hat or whatever I'm working on, or do I see the inside? Because if descending from these stitches looks like the outside, then this is the place to start. So you want, when you pick it up, to have the base of the triangle towards you and the point away, rather than the inside out option has the flat of the triangle away from you and the point towards you. So that's kind of the two things to look for. So assuming that we've got everything we need, we're going to put this yarn here. I like to put mine to the outside because then I don't need a beginning of round marker. And we just work our way around. So we've picked up and now we knit. And by separating the two, we've really reduced the amount of stress and worry and getting in our own way, because picking up and getting the yarn through the stitch at the same time just adds a layer of confusion that we don't need. Now the trick is, remember, if you've used a smaller needle, don't keep knitting with that. That one has to go away. You have to get the right size. I use these needles because they show up very well on camera, but they are a little slipperier than I would recommend. I have a video in this series on needle types and materials that, if you are interested, will be linked below. So there we are. We have picked up, then we've knit, and we've avoided knitting inside out. If you still find this a little tricky, I have another tip for you coming right up, which is to use a contrasting yarn. Another option is to run contrasting yarn into the stitches where you would be picking up stitches. So for instance, I am now at the point where my next step in this hat is to knit the ribbing. So before I knit the ribbing, I'm going to place contrasting yarn on a needle, a yarn needle, and just thread it through all these stitches. One important thing is to avoid going through stitch markers. If you do that, the stitch marker can't keep moving as you knit the next rounds, and it becomes quite awkward. So make sure you stop, check that you're not going through that, but going under it, and then lay that contrasting yarn into the round where you know that you're going to want to pick up stitches. All right, so if we have placed the contrasting yarn above the pickup or in the pickup round, when we flip the yarn or the hat inside out, you will see that we have a marker telling us where we can pick things up. Now, when we pick things up, we can pick up this flat part of the stitch that I sometimes describe as having sort of there being caps and smiles. Well, if we've done the contrasting yarn, what we are actually going to be doing is picking up the leg of the stitch, and it's hidden normally when we do this. But if I pull this apart here, you can see that here would be the cap, and here is the leg of the stitch. And so if we are going to follow the contrast yarn, we are going to be picking up in the leg of the stitch, and that's fine. The main thing with gnomes is merely to pick up the number of stitches we need, or as close to it as we can, so that we can, you know, knit two together, or increase if we need to like get to the right stitch count. We can increase or decrease. The trick is to look below the stitches and to make sure that you are picking up one leg per stitch of, in this case, ribbing. So it is sometimes a little hard to see what you're supposed to do, but go slowly and carefully, and remember that it's okay to be wrong. If you accidentally pierce through that yarn as you are going, like if I accidentally catch a tiny ply of the dark green, when I go to pull this out, it will snag. In that case, just take a pair of scissors and very gently cut the yarn sort of at that spot. If you were to cut here, you'll be able to kind of work it through. But that's all there is to this. In this case, we are picking up following the contrast yarn, and we're going to be picking up the leg of the stitches. I hope that this helps you, and that you can just remember not to worry about picking up stitches, that there's guidelines, but there's really no wrong way to do it as long as you're ending up with the right number of stitches or close enough, and that whatever you're doing leaves it so that it's flexible enough. If you're doing something so that stitches are twisting or whatever, you may find that you make this round very tight. So just remember to kind of don't get too worried about this.